workplace readiness for digital learning. Thank you so much for choosing this session. I know there's a lot of choice here today. We're the London School Group. We provide training in language, communication, intercultural and global leadership skills, all with the aim of helping people to work more effectively across borders and cultures. We do that through both face-to-face and digital learning solutions. My name's Cathy Wellings. I'm responsible for the London School of International Communication, so that's our intercultural arm.
My name's Andy Johnson and I run London School Online, which is the name which suggests is all of our online training and online services.
Can everyone hear us okay? Fantastic. So what we really want to do today is blend the two areas of expertise from our business and talk about how some of the things we need to consider if we're really going to make e-learning, digital learning effective in a global environment.
Yep. And today's talk is going to cover three areas. First of all, we'll look at the approaches to digital learning, the things that we've learned from providing digital solutions, and then we'll finish with some advice if you're looking to put your own solution in place. But we're going to start with this quote of Myth Information. And I always come back to this when I talk about online training because I think it's got a good meaning. So it was from Langdon Winner in 1984, and he says that the almost religious conviction that a widespread adoption of computers and communication systems, along with broad access to electronic information, will automatically produce a better world for humanity. And I think we can almost apply the same logic to e-learning. You'll find a lot of very good e-learning here today, but really what we're looking at today is how it's then embedded within your corporate culture and how you can make a success of it. E-learning in of itself doesn't always work, it's how you then embed it within your culture. And we find that learners will either embrace it and they're very self-directed, or they can really struggle with it and they need a lot more help and assistance. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to look at today. Really the point is that one size doesn't always fit all, and it isn't the easy solution that some people may think it is.
And I think there's a real disconnect. We certainly have clients now who only offer digital training to their employees. There's no face-to-face at all. But yeah, I'm sure you've all seen those statistics that something like only 15% of employers actually think that their digital solutions are effective. I think when it comes to completion rates, isn't it something around 30% of users actually finish the program, and just because they've finished it doesn't necessarily mean they've learnt anything. They've ticked the box, and if they have learnt, often it's short term rather than long term. So we really need to look at where that disconnect is coming from, and I think when we're working globally, some of those challenges that we find with digital learning are only amplified and magnified. So that's really what we'll be talking about today. And we're going to look at this through three key approaches, whether you globalize your solution, you localize it, or you look at a blended approach.
So we take the first approach, this globalization approach, and really it's this idea that you create one solution that you can then use across many, many territories. You have to neutralize the content, you have to remove all evidence of cultural markers. It's almost like the Bennetization of e-learning, if you like, as the picture might suggest. And there's good sides and there's bad sides to this. Of course, it's cost effective, you're only building the solution once. And you also have a real consistency of delivery, so the training that you might deliver in the UK is going to be identical to the training you deliver in other territories, in the US or in India, for example. The downside is that by removing all of those cultural markers and making it identical, you're trying to speak to everyone, and in some cases you end up speaking to no one. You actually create quite a vanilla solution.
So the complete reverse of the internationalization approach is to look at localizing. So perhaps looking at translated versions, bringing back those cultural markers, speaking much more to the local audiences that you're working with. And by doing that, your learning should be much more engaging, more targeted. But the downside, I think there's a proviso that actually sometimes when we localize, we get it wrong. I've seen so many poor translations of e-learning. The cultural sensitivity, it can be very, very easy to get it wrong, to generalize, to stereotype. And obviously this is a much more expensive, much more time-consuming approach. So there's swings and roundabouts again.
Yeah, and you have this paradox between simplicity versus expertise. If you are going to roll out training in a number of languages, you need to make sure that your base version, your original version, is really stripped back and as simple as possible, because when you start translating, it has to be a very simple model. So there's this kind of paradox that you're trying to be very niche, you're trying to be very targeted, but your original model is actually quite basic. And then the final option, of course, is blended, and blended can mean a number of things. It could be, it's not just online and face-to-face, it could be a mix of virtual classroom, it could be forums, it could be moderated elements. This offers you the greatest amount of flexibility, of course, greater personalisation and engagement, because you're bringing in the human touch, the element of a trainer who can direct the learning. Of course, the negative of that is that you're adding a layer of cost, a layer of complexity, and also, in the reverse of the first option that we looked at, you're actually opening yourselves to greater potential inconsistencies. Inconsistencies in the sense that people learn at different speeds, and these are quite often revealed when you have a blended approach, but also inconsistencies in how the trainer will deliver. Every trainer is slightly different, so as soon as you bring in a blended approach, you're removing that element. At London School Group, we offer all three. We always bring in an element of personalisation, and we have a lot of content that we can pick and blend and create different solutions.
So what we'd like to do next is talk about the process we go through with our clients and the almost three lenses that we encourage anyone working globally to consider as they're building and defining any learning solution really, whether it's face-to-face or digital in this case. So we look at the local context, the culture and the language.
So context really is, where is the learner? Where are they going to be doing the digital learning? What is their situation? What is their location? And there's a lot we can say about this, but just a few areas to highlight. The first one is around legislation. If it's health and safety training or if it's HR training, then the legislation will obviously differ by territory, so it's very difficult to create one learning solution across multiple territories. Second one, tech readiness and hardware. In some developing countries, they've gone straight to mobile, so whatever you're delivering should be mobile first. Our platform is, in terms of people who use it and access it, 52% are on mobile. But surprisingly, the second largest cohort is still desktop. We only have 13% of users that will go in on tablet computers. It's still 35% on desktop. We have done a large training program with a company called Corbin & King, who offer hospitality training. And what was surprising about that is that the level of smartphone ownership amongst the group of people taking the course was surprisingly low. So we had to, when it comes to your context, you have to think about how you're going to deal with that issue. So for Corbin & King, they had to make sure that the learners had access to fixed workstations around their shift work. And Cathy, you've got an example of an organisation in Brazil?
I mean, it's a silly example in a way, but we work with one of the leading universities in Sao Paulo, and they invited us to deliver virtual classroom training for some of their senior professors. Set everything up, sent out the joining instructions. I'm quite surprised that probably only about half the names on the list logged on at the starting time. And we found out afterwards that everyone had participated, but half of the group had actually gone to the office of our coordinator and hadn't really digested the fact that it was digital learning. And it comes back to this idea that it's a little bit of a myth that everyone is digital ready and digital is always the solution. Particularly somewhere like Brazil, learning is collaborative, it's about relationships, and the idea of logging on at a computer was just, they couldn't compute. So something there in how we position, how we get people a little bit more digital ready before we run these kind of programs.
And then there's infrastructure challenges. For example, in India, they're often open to power cuts. We do a lot of webinars and virtual training in India, and at the beginning of every session you have to warn that there may be a power cut, and it has happened on a couple of occasions. And what happens if that happens? How long you can expect the webinar to drop out for, what we will do if that happens.
It always happens twice.
Always happens twice, they come in twos. In South Africa, for example, parts of the country are subject to rolling blackouts, so often the times that the electricity will be switched off is actually released at quite short notice, so you have to be quite flexible there and be agile with how you plan your sessions. The final two are around working schedules and time differences. Working schedules, I mentioned Corbin and King earlier. Most of the learners on that course are working in kitchens, they're working back of house, front of house, it's definitely shift work. So the time that they get to do the e-learning is at quite unusual times. And that typical classroom schedule completely goes out of the window, particularly if you think about something like oil and gas, where people may be on rig for 10 weeks at a time and then off rig. So you've got to plan accordingly. And then the final point is around time differences. We were doing a training program in Australia recently, and of course you've got multiple time zones just in the same country. Same goes for Russia, for the States. So it's about finding the time that works best for a wide range of people. We're also working with a client at the moment who has asked us to do training for learners from Israel, Iran and Turkey. And we'll talk a little bit about the cultural element and challenges of that in a moment. But just in that group, you've got 6 different time zones.
So the cultural considerations. Now I'm sure you've all seen many of these kind of typical visual cultural faux pas when people get it wrong in terms of food and drink, in terms of dress codes, gender roles, and some of these gestures which for us in the West tend to signify well done, great job, but can cause offence in other parts of the world. But for us, culture is a lot deeper than what your imagery looks like and getting nice pictures on your platform. There's a lot more to think about. And I think coming from a place of ignorance when it comes to culture can be very, very dangerous. And we really need to be culturally sensitive when it comes to looking at cross-border relationships, when it comes to ethnic rivalries within a given country. And I know, Andy, you've got a story there.
Last year we did a program for the Georgian Institute of Strategic Studies, and it had a very simple brief, and that was to promote world peace through the English language, so there was no pressure on us at all. And we took 60 Georgian learners, 30 of whom identified as Abkhazian, which is a minority group within the country. And for our trainers, it was a challenge because the first thing that you would usually do on a training course, be it face-to-face or virtual, is to do some kind of icebreaker. So where are you from? Tell me about your family, all those kinds of things. And we simply couldn't touch that because it would raise so many issues. So straight away we had challenges there around geopolitical tensions. And online learning and digital learning differs, I think, from face-to-face because in many cases you've only really got one chance to get it right. Because if you're doing face-to-face, then presumably the people will be there for a certain amount of time and you can kind of make up for any faux pas or any issues that you may encounter. But for online, what do the learners do? They just drop out and you don't get them back.
So just a few more examples in terms of drivers which influence cross-cultural behaviours, particularly in a learning context. So time obviously is a big differential when working globally. And it's not just that question of what does on time mean. Obviously if you're running virtual classrooms, what do you do with you've got the people that arrive 10 minutes early because that's what on time means, and then you've got the ones that arrive 10, 15 minutes late because that's what on time means in their part of the world. So again, skilling up the trainers to manage that gradual entry is important. When we look at time, and when we say here, whose time, some of our clients actually expect their learners to conduct their e-learning outside of working hours. They've given them the tools and it's their prerogative to find the time to develop their language skills typically. What we find with certain cultures, certain parts of the world, it just doesn't work. It causes it's quite provocative. Places like Sweden, Norway, some of the Eastern European countries we've worked in, workplace learning takes place at work, and even suggesting Friday afternoons, which is the segue into the weekend, causes a lot of raised eyebrows. So understanding some of those sensitivities helps position the learning in an appropriate way. You may be familiar with these terms, individualistic and collectivist cultures. Just a couple of things regarding this. think about how you position your training project. Countries like ours, so the UK and the US, are probably the two most individualistic cultures in the world. So when we position training, we often use words like self-development, self-fulfillment. It will build your future career. It will give you something personal as well as professional. And that tends to motivate learners here to think, well, this is great. This is going to help me. If you look at more collectivist cultures, typically across Asia, some of the Latin cultures, there's much more of a community focus. So it's more positioning the training as, well, this will really help us collaborate and perhaps even benefit the common good, the wider community. And I think something else that's come up for us quite recently, we use a lot of psychometrics in our blended approaches, and working with a few Japanese clients recently, that idea of introspection and looking in on yourself is an anathema. With the best will in the world, our learners from that part of the world just find it very difficult to turn in on themselves. So again, it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but how we set it up and position it is important. One final thing on this is around the competitive elements. I know some e-learning platforms will have things like leaderboards, so you can compete with your colleagues and see who's got the best score in the test or how many units you've completed. Again, works well in this part of the world, but less well in the collectivist cultures where perhaps more collaborative engagement tools work more effectively. Hierarchy, a couple of things here. Again, we're very egalitarian in this part of the world, the Anglo, the North European cultures. And if you look at the literature, at the moment it's all around personalization, self-direction. The learner chooses the content and the approach that works for them. And that's the way Andy has developed his platform. It's very much, there's content available and you select what's appropriate for you. We've taken this product to Japan, and the feedback there has been, well, where's the structure?
Where do I start?
Where's the pathway? What do I do? And that whole concept of, well, the learner has control. In hierarchical cultures, there's much more of an expectation, tell me what to do, how to do it, show me the line, the linear approach I need to follow, and then I'll do it. So again, it's kind of blending those two approaches.
And then the final area is language. To what extent do you want to expose your learners to different cultures, and what language are you going to deliver it in? We mentioned translation earlier. From a very practical point of view, if you're going to take training that was originally in English and put it into Spanish, for example, then you need 20% more space on your screen. And if you're doing something mobile first, that will take up a lot of space. The same goes for Russian. If you're presenting it in Arabic, think about how you've got to then change the position of the pictures because the script goes the other way across the screen. And if your training is in English, which I imagine for most of you it probably will be, who's English? I mean, we have 400 million what you would class native speakers in the world, but they're the minority. You have 400 million speakers of English as a second language, and then you have 600 to 700 million speakers of English as a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, whatever language. So whose English are you going to use? What is the context of the learner? And if you're not dealing with that first group, the native English speakers, then think very carefully about how you need to grade the language, how you need to remove all the idiomatic language. And idioms is interesting as well because we've recently done a medical English training program with doctors coming from overseas to work in the NHS. And the converse is true, because there you need to actually teach them a lot about English idioms, because when an English person goes to the doctor, they rarely tell you what is wrong with them without using an idiom. They may feel a little bit under the weather. They may feel a little bit dicky. And for a doctor who's never encountered that expression before, there's a real challenge there. And the final point really is levels of formality. Again, we are quite informal in English with how we present particularly instructions and rubrics on our platforms. But for example, in German, you have to think about the different forms of address. German is a much more formal language altogether.
So just coming through to the final part of the presentation, we'd really like to just pull out some practical tips and takeaways from some of these considerations we've been talking about. And we'll kind of use the process of development, launch and embedding just to pull out those tips.
So you can see the learning platform there on the screen. And in terms of development, the questions that you really need to ask yourself is, what blend are you looking for? What will be the most useful and effective for the learner? What languages, of course, and what is the learner context? I think that's a really key one. And really do your cultural due diligence. Really engage with stakeholders at all levels of your organisation to find out exactly what it is that you're going to need in order to create something that's really going to work.
So in terms of launching our programme, our solution, we all know we need to have a clear communication strategy with practical details around timelines, locations, but it's a little bit deeper than that when it comes to looking at the cultural context again. If we're looking at how we position the benefits, again here in the Anglo, the English-speaking world, it's very much a what's in it for me approach. So what will I get from this? What do I have to do? Simple, short communication. If we're launching it globally, we need to think about the motivators for the different territories and markets we're working in. Perhaps the community benefits, the relationship building, and there's also an element of if it's coming from the top down, if it's driven from the hierarchy, there may be more of an impetus to engage in the training. And I think the other thing here is the communication is think about the style as well as the method of communication. So how much detail do you need to provide? I think a really clear example is the difference between the French and the British communication style. Apologies if there are any French people in the audience and I don't quite get it right, but typically in France, the communication is very much theory first. So give us the rationale, the theory, almost the philosophy, and then tell us the practical details afterwards. Your Anglo audience will have probably lost interest by the time they actually get to the crunch, and we're more of a pragmatic, we have a more pragmatic communication style. So tell me what I need to do, and then you can give me the background afterwards. And then Andy, you were going to talk a little bit more about the positioning with the Corbyn and King example.
Yeah, so in the picture, this is Eleanor, who is a junior chef at Corbyn and King, and she's a real success story for their e-learning program. And for that organisation, they got two things right from the very beginning. The first was, both regarding internal positioning, they had buy-in from the very top, so the two owners of the group were really committed to providing a learning solution for employers, not just to help them with their English in the workplace, but also to support them in everyday life. Because quite often, I mean, Eleanor herself is from Moldova, and she's come over here and left her small daughter at home with her parents. So there's a lot of emotional support that you can give through language and training. But what really made it work well was how they positioned it from the bottom up. So within the organisation, there are peer champions, peer-to-peer champions, who support the learning journey throughout for everyone who's on the programme. And what Corbyn and King did was create a learning passport. So every time somebody completed a milestone, they got a stamp in their passport. So that kind of made it quite tangible for them.
So the programme's launched and we kind of think our work is done. We've spent so many hours, days and weeks building the programme, but actually this is where the work starts, and it's the adjustments, the modifications, how we respond to feedback, which really determines the long-term success very often of a digital programme. And I think, again, just thinking about how we get feedback, a couple of things from a cultural perspective. Firstly, what forum do we use? Is it a feedback form? Are we doing one-to-one interviews or focus groups? You may find in certain parts of the world people won't speak out in a group situation. And I think just a couple of other things. There are certain cultures, the North European, I think typically, where feedback isn't about telling the positives. We don't really need to give praise because it's expected. So again, you may find in certain parts of the world your feedback is lower, and it's very much focusing on what people don't like and what they feel they need to change. Whereas conversely, there are cultures where saving face is much more important, and the idea of giving negative messages, giving criticism, again, will be much harder. So it's just things to think about when you're looking at how you collect feedback.
And how you shape your questions is equally as important. If you're going to ask people to give your program a score from 1 to 5, they're probably going to choose 3 because that's the nice easy middle ground. So always use a 4-point scale instead of a 5-point scale. It makes them have to commit one way or the other. But also powerful questions when you're getting feedback. Ask learners what's the most frustrating part about learning what they are learning, and that will reveal much more than asking them what they thought of the program so far. Also, it's a real challenge for organisations is to avoid response bias. We often ask the questions that will give us the responses that we want to hear. So think very carefully about how you're collecting feedback on your programmes. So, to finish, this is us, the London School Group. We are made up of 3 separate organisations: London School Online, the London School of International Communication, and the London School of English, which is the world's oldest accredited language school, has been going since 1912, with some of the original teachers, I should say. This is our training centre in Holland Park Gardens. We also have a second training centre in West London and also one in Canterbury. Also we have a training centre in Stockholm. So we are very close, so if you would like to come in and see us, we are just up the road. But today, we'd love to see you at stand 686. Please do come along. We are just around the corner there.
And if anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to answer them in the round, or otherwise come and see us or over at the stand. So
thank you for your time.
Thank you.